follow-up video to the last problem on the previous video, where it says to you the tangent of the arcsecant of 0, that's the question, and then I rewrote it as the tangent of the inverse secant of 0. Same thing, different notation. So I think you may have been confused by the explanation for the previous problem, so I want to look at it graphically. So pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, and negative pi over 2. So this is another way to look at how I got undefined and what that means. We have not done secant graphs. I don't think we did, at least. So I'm going to construct secant as being 1 over the cosine. Secant is 1 over cosine. Let's start with a cosine graph. So the cosine graph there's my cosine graph. Okay. If the cosine is 0, then the secant is undefined. Okay, think about that for a minute. Cosine is 0, secant is undefined. Why? Because secant is 1 over the cosine, 1 over 0, undefined. Secant, 1 over the cosine, so if cosine is 0, 1 over 0, undefined. And on a graph, that shows up as asymptotes. On a graph, that shows up as asymptotes. Cosine is 0 at pi over 2. Cosine is 0 at 3 pi over 2. And then if we were to keep going, we would have negative pi over 2. Okay, and I'm going to erase. Okay, gives us a little bit more room. So, cosine, secant, reciprocals. Cosine and secant are reciprocals. So, if the cosine is 1, reciprocal of 1 is 1. So the secant is 1. I'll make it obnoxious. And then at 2 pi, if the cosine is 1, the secant is 1. And at pi, if the cosine is negative 1, the secant is negative 1. So I got these 3 obnoxious points. Okay. Between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, the cosine curve kind of looks like a parabola. It's parabesque. So it looks parabola-ish, right side up. So the secant is upside down. I just flipped it over. For a reciprocal, flip it over. There we go. Here, the cosine curve from 1 down to pi over 2. So the secant curve is going to go 1, and it's going to approach the asymptote, which I erased. And then from 3 pi over 2 to 2 pi, it's curved down. So if you take the reciprocal, if you flip it up, it curves up. And again, I lost some of my... This looks kind of funky, right? I mean, we got half the parabola going up between 0 and pi over 2, and then we have the other half going up between 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. So generically, we move the far right onto the left. There is your parent secant curve. There's your parent secant curve. Where is the secant 0? I erased the original problem. The original problem was the tangent of the inverse secant of 0. This was the original problem. Some angle whose secant is 0. Look at the graph. Where does the graph of secant touch the axis? It doesn't. And that is another way to look at, this is impossible. So this is another way to look at the answer to this question being undefined. Do you have to know the graph? No. It's good to be exposed to it. And I think for some of you, that makes more sense to see how come the answer to this question was undefined.